Hello, my name's Michael Walsh, and I'm the editor and commissioner of the new book, Against the Corporate Media, 42 Ways the Press Hates You. This book originated with the idea that the media is seriously biased in favor of the left liberal side of the equation. And as a result, I commissioned some 40-plus essays on various sins of the media, including their inability to report political news straight, their utter ignorance of things such as the military, police, firearms, etc., their institutional leverage they exercise over the public discourse, and many other sins of the flesh and spirit that we wanted to attack in this book. So I was very pleased that we got the response that we did. The book is now just out, and with me today to talk about his reaction to the book is an old and dear friend of mine, Mr. Tony Palmer, the distinguished director of more than 100 films, of opera, theater, and an all-around bon vivant and man about town, Tony Palmer. Tony, welcome.
Thank you. I've never heard myself described like that before. Can I have that in writing, please?
Yes, you may.
It would help my PR enormously.
So, Tony, you've had a chance to look at the book, not as one of the writers of it, but as a respondent to some of the themes in it. But before we get to the specifics, I'd like you to tell us about your own experiences with the media. You're on the receiving end of the media throughout your career. You've had responses to the films you've made for the BBC and for theatrical release, stage productions of operatic masterpieces, and the critics have, of course, opened up and had their say. How have you been treated? Fairly, unfairly? How would you characterize it?
Oh, ignored, I think, is the best way of describing it. I just want to correct you on one thing before we go on. The subtitle of the book is 42 Ways the Press Hates You.
Yes.
I think the great thing about this book is it provides us with 42 ways in which we hate the press. That, I think, is the real upshot of it. I mean, I've read every single one of the 490 some odd pages.
Yes.
And the essays are an extraordinary potpourri. I mean, some of the authors I just wanted to throttle after the first paragraph or so. And some I wanted to light a candle. But they do have one really important thing in common, which, again, I don't think is necessarily a bias one way or the other, except I'm sure we'll come to that. But I'd just like to read you one quote, which seemed to me to sum up the entire book. This is by a man called John Gabriel. It says, "It's difficult to describe how awful modern journalism has become. It is preening, biased, ignorant, vainglorious, arrogant, unfair, corrupt, vindictive, smug, anti-science, and stupid beyond measure." I'd agree with every word of that. I mean, my experience of that is partly newspapers. I mean, for example, you mentioned I'd made rather a lot of films. One film I made, and it happens to be important this year, is a film about Gustav Holst, who famously wrote something called The Planets. There's one problem there. He didn't actually call it The Planets, but never mind. We'll just ignore that. The Times music critic, not the main one, but a Times music critic wrote, and I can quote this almost verbatim, that there was a poem written by Cecil Rice called I Vow to Thee, My Country, later set to music by Gustav Holst. I mean, that's a lie. And it's also not true. And the fact that it was such a terrible lie broke Holst completely. This was a man who was, in every sense other than the word, a communist. I mean, he was extremely left-wing. There's a story that he and the other great English composer, Vaughan Williams, they used to go on these walks around England, so-called collecting folk songs. The correspondence that we now have at our disposal says that neither of them really liked these walks. Holst didn't like them because Vaughan Williams was rather large and slowed him down somewhat. Vaughan Williams didn't like them because Holst was always very sick. He was asthmatic, he suffered terribly from neuritis and always complaining. However, in all the books about these two and their walks, they say we arrived in Thaxted, which is a village in the eastern part of England. I think it's in Essex. And we went, and I don't, for those who've never been to Thaxted, I mean, the church in Thaxted is bigger than the village. I mean, it's absolutely enormous. It's cathedral-like size. And we went in, says all the books say, we went into the village, we went into the church in Thaxted, and Holst immediately felt at home, and this is where I'm going to settle, and that is indeed where he did settle. This was immediately before the First World War. This ignores a really important fact. It is true that they went into the church, but the first thing that Holst saw was the red flag. The second thing that he saw was the flag of what became Sinn Féin. He and the priest, who was called Conrad Knoll, that's why he settled there, because he thought, I'm at home. This is where I'm really at home. This is a guy who had taught in Morley College, which was founded at the end of the 19th century as a place for working class people in the East End of London. And he used to cycle around the East End distributing copies of the Workers' Press. I mean, this is not a guy who would write, I vow to thee my country. He was so outraged by this later use, as I said, it broke him. Right, back to Thaxted, he sets up a printing press during the First World War with the priest who was called Conrad Knoll, and they're churning out pamphlet after pamphlet after pamphlet, and Holst would pin, I've got a copy of one, Holst would pin on the door of the church handwritten notes in which he would say, the bell will toll at noon for those slaughtered by imperialism. Now, someone who thinks that and feels that very strongly is not going to have his music set to words, I vow to thee my country, which is the ultimate patriotic song.
Yes.
It's an outrage.
Well, let's put that for the American audiences who may not know that the big
Well,
two...
they do, because, with respect, Michael, they do, because they know something called the planets. The fact that Holst never called it the planets is neither here nor there. But this comes to the root of the false representation by newspapers, by a distinguished music critic in the Times of London. This just illustrates to me exactly that quote that I said. These people are ignorant buffoons.
Well, you know the famous line from The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, when the truth becomes legend, print the legend. So they printed the legend about Holst by ignoring his extremely far-left background and his commitment to social justice and all of the movements that were roiling Europe and Britain at the time.
And in America.
Yes.
And in the United States.
So how have they treated you? Then I know you made this wonderful movie about Holst, which I had the chance to see last time I saw you here in England. What about the way your work has been received? Let's take an example for the Trojans, for example, an opera I know you're passionate about. And now, after knowing you for 40 plus years, I'm now passionate about the Trojans as well. So talk about that. There's a work that's not done very often, and what did they say about it, for example?
Well, with respect, that's not a very good example, because it had very good reviews, both the film, which was about Berlioz, and Berlioz struggled to write the Trojans, which is a huge opera. It's only about 4 minutes longer than Tristan and Isolde by Wagner, but nonetheless, it's not often done. It's not done enough, considering the masterpiece that it is.
Yeah.
My struggle with it was getting it done at all, and I was able to do it in Zurich, in the Zurich Opera House in Switzerland, simply because I'd done 2 operas immediately before, and they were both huge hits. So it was a kind of, what would you like to do now? So I said, how about the Trojans? They blanched. But eventually they were persuaded. No, that's not a very good example. I mean, for an American audience, I think an American audience would understand this. The changing landscape of what is allowed, I use the word advisedly, allowed on British television, the BBC, essentially, has changed beyond recognition in the last 30 or 40 years. I mean, there was a time, for example, when the arts were central to the BBC's output. And in fact, the last Director General but one, who'd previously been the boss of the Royal Opera House, said music is in the DNA of the BBC. Now, the excuse for justifying this remark always was, well, we have the proms. It's perfectly true. The promenade concerts, which happen throughout the summer, still going on at the moment as we speak. I think something like 80 concerts are devoted to classical music, and they're all on the radio, and quite a number of them are now on television. The rest of the year is a desert. Nothing, absolutely nothing. But this is symptomatic to me of, okay, so it's a niche. Classical music, as it were, is a niche within a niche within a niche. But this is symptomatic of what has gone wrong with the BBC. I mean, the BBC is now, the only future for the BBC, it seems to me, is to disband it. How can you possibly justify someone who's just reading a teleprompter being paid £500,000? I mean, this is outrageous. And I'm not talking about the man who's a convicted felon, who the BBC went on paying over £200,000, even though he knew he was guilty of the crimes for which he was being dismissed by the BBC. They went on paying him. But most of the newsreaders are paid, the principal newsreaders are paid £500,000 for doing what? Reading words off a teleprompter. No, they think they are themselves the news and preen themselves to that effect. For example, there's a man who is frequently described, partly because of his colour, I suspect, as the fearless frontline reporter. He's now jockeying to be the head newsreader of News at 10, which is one of the principal news outlets of the BBC, News at 10 in the evening. He appeared the day the Ukraine war broke out, or the day after the Ukraine war broke out. He appeared on the top of a hotel with a flap jacket and a helmet. And I know that hotel very well because I know the capital of Ukraine extremely well. And that's miles from the front line, miles and miles and miles from the front line. And he then said, I'm talking to you from Kyiv. Now, I've been going to the Ukraine for 40 years. I've never met a single person in the Ukraine ever who called it Kyiv. It's 2 syllables. All right, the spelling has changed from Russian to Ukrainian, but it ain't Kyiv. However, because this moron said Kyiv, then all the other newsreaders said Kyiv. And he's so stupid, this man, that at a later date, not very far, much later, he now is interviewing the ambassador, the Ukrainian ambassador to London, who happened to be back in the Ukraine. And this moron then talks about Kyiv, to which the ambassador very pointedly replied, here in Kiev. So this idiot goes on about Kyiv. So he's not only stupid, he's deaf, and he's being presented by the BBC as the fearless frontline reporter. Now, there are some absolutely heroic, really heroic frontline reporters for the BBC who risk their lives and are really there being shot at and mortared at. I mean, it's extraordinary, the risks they take. This man, however, the fearless frontline reporter, ain't one of them. Now, when the present Director General came into power at the BBC, the BBC issues a kind of annual report every year. He vowed to cut down middle management. He said these people are, that some are necessary, but most are redundant. Now, I looked this up. There are approximately 72 middle managers at that point that he said it, okay? That's about 5 years ago. Each of them was paid at least 50% more than our Prime Minister. Whichever one of our strange prime ministers you want to pick. Okay. Today, in the new BBC annual report, the 72 or 73, has mysteriously been downgraded to 125. You can see them. They're listed. 125 people being paid at least 50% more than the Prime Minister. Now, that is just symptomatic as what is wrong with the BBC. The BBC has no sense of direction. It has no... It's easy to say, oh, well, it can't compete with the streamers and it can't compete with people like Netflix and Apple and so on. It's not a question of competing. It's a question of being focused on what is your function? Why are you here? And if one of your functions is to accurately report the news, I don't believe a word they tell me anymore. I really do not believe anything that they tell me.
Now, with your own career, you made films about classical music. You worked with Jonathan Miller, for example, and Ken
Russell.
Yes, Ken Russell. There'd be no place for that at the BBC.
No,
today.
none at all. None at all.
So a young filmmaker like yourself wouldn't have that hands-on, continuous hands-on experience.
Well, and wouldn't, not a question of hands-on, it wouldn't get in.
Yeah.
I can give you a perfect example. Next year, I think, is Richard Burton's 100th birthday. I knew Richard Burton extremely well. I worked with him in a big film about Wagner, German composer.
You did.
And also, I made a film about him 2 or 3 years after he died. And, I can't think of a more extraordinary and wonderful, in terms of screen, I didn't see him on the stage, unfortunately, dynamic actor of our time. He's one of the all-time greats, okay? He was a very complex character. Leave aside his relationship with the mad Elizabeth Taylor, who I adored. But she could drink anybody under the table, and she could certainly drink Richard under the table. But she was lovely. She was tiny, of course. Yeah. But leaving that aspect of it aside, what an extraordinary career to be, to have done Hamlet on Broadway. I think for 2 months, completely sold out in modern dress, to have been a star of Royal Shakespeare Company, where he was spotted, in fact, by Lauren Bacall, taken to Hollywood, to have made all the films that he did, of which I would say 10 are some of the greatest films in terms of performance you've ever seen, like Spy Who Came from the Cold, or Beckett, or Equus, for example. This huge character, complex character. BBC are doing its 100th birthday celebration. Guess how long it is? 55 minutes. That's what's wrong with the BBC. How can it think that you can explain someone as complicated as Richard Burton in 55 minutes? You can't. It's an outrage. But they'll do hours and hours and hours of gardening programs, of cooking programs. Just rubbish. I'm sorry, rubbish.
To what do you attribute that, the final question, to the media itself and the way the media has changed? When we first met, for example, I was the music critic for Time magazine. Now there basically isn't any more Time magazine, and they certainly wouldn't have a classical music critic doing the job that I was doing in the mid-1980s and through the 1990s. Has the media totally abdicated its job in terms of the preservation of the culture?
Well, as far as I can only speak really about the BBC and about Channel 4 and about ITV, because that's all I watch, as it were. I don't watch it anymore. I watch Netflix. But yes, they have totally abnegated their responsibility there. It's quite interesting that one of the... I was in the BBC from 1966 to 1971. It's always described as the golden age of television. I don't necessarily agree with that, because subsequently there have been some wonderful dramas, there have even been some wonderful documentaries, there are wonderful films about really difficult political problems. But as far as the arts are concerned, as far as culture is concerned, yes, they have absolutely washed their hands of it, except, of course, the BBC will always use the proms as an excuse. Look what we do, aren't we good? And there's a dreadful voice which comes on all the time which says, Radio 3, the home of classical music. Bollocks, I mean, to that. Bollocks to most of the BBC, actually. But it seems to me that the upshot, what is lacking is any sense of leadership. When I joined the BBC, the Director General was a man called Hugh Green, was the brother of Graham Greene, the novelist. He was very clear that culture, for want of a better word, was an integral part of the BBC's output, with drama, with news, with sport, with everything else. But it was essentially a mixed bag, as it were, and that was what the BBC stood for, integrity, some sort of integrity. That has gone. That has completely gone. One of Hugh Green's lieutenants was an amazing Welshman called Hugh Weldon. And Hugh Weldon's mantra always was to everybody who was trying to make films of whether of culture or drama or whatever, he said, I don't care if it's a failure. I'm not interested in whether it's success or a failure. The only thing that interests me, and this was his mantra, say what you mean, and for heaven's sake, mean what you say. That's all he cared about. Now, that's gone completely from the BBC. Going back to the Richard Burton documentary, which I've been interviewed about, because I knew him, this 55-minute trawl through the life of Richard Burton. The guy was deeply apologetic when he came to see me and explained his problem, which was being restricted in length. And he said, you've no idea what happens. I will do the film, I will make a cut, I then show it to a focus group. Or if it's not called a focus group, there's kind of five or six other people who will sit around and look, and then they'll make suggestions. They're not suggestions, they're demands. So he has to go back and do it again. He said that will go through 5 or 6 times. Then what happens, he says, is you're not in the hands of the commissioning editor, you're in the hands of the scheduler. Now, I have a wonderful example of that. Since I mentioned Vaughan Williams, I made for Channel 5, which then was called the Pornographer's Channel, certainly wasn't, but that was the description it was given. In 2008, I made a huge film about Vaughan Williams. I kept saying, this man, this composer, his music bestrides the 20th century English landscape like a colossus. You can't ignore him. We must do something. Heard of Greensleeves? That was part of my pitch.
Right.
He didn't actually write Greensleeves. Heard of Greensleeves. Anyway, eventually they agreed. And they didn't specify the length, oddly enough, in the contract. So me being me, I just did what I thought was the right thing. So brought the film back. It was 2 hours and 30 minutes long. That's a bit long. I accept that. And so I went to the screening for the commissioning editor and for the boss of Channel 5, the Pornographer's Channel, and sort of vaguely apologised. I said, I'm sorry it's worked out so long, such a long film, but I think it's an important subject, you see. So I sat there nervously as the film rolled through, and at the end there was complete silence, and I thought, well, what the hell are they going to say? Can you find a good 20-minute film inside there? And they stopped and looked at each other, and they said, God, that's a masterpiece. We will show it. Wonderful. They then came up with a brilliant solution as to how to show it. New Year's Day in the afternoon, when everybody's kind of drunk, or as, to some extent soporific. So we'll show it on New Year's Day, starting at 2 o'clock, and it'll run to sort of 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I thought, well, that's a wonderful piece of scheduling, and I was grovelling. And so this was all agreed about 2 weeks before Christmas. And all the press handouts were agreed and went out, and it was trailed heavily, getting a wonderful preview, notices, etc., etc. Then I get a copy of some magazine or newspaper where I'm looking to see when, checking when my film is on, and it's been moved from 2 o'clock in the afternoon to 9 o'clock in the morning on New Year's Day, when everyone is either dead drunk or dead or both. You see what I mean? So I thought, nobody's going to watch this film. Nobody at that time of day. However, the film went out at that time of day, And so I rang the commissioning editor between Christmas and New Year and said, what the hell has happened? And she said, well, I'm afraid I don't know, and I can't do anything about it now. It's too late. It's already gone into the electronic system, as it were. We later discovered that the the scheduler, there is such a breed of people. I mean, they're not comparable in newspapers at all. I don't know what. The scheduler had thought, we can't show a film about this classical composer of 2.5 hours on New Year's Day in the afternoon. We're not having that. He noticed that there was also a film that day on the Pornographer's channel. I think it was called Last of the Pharaohs, and it was almost exactly the same length, and that was going out in the morning. So he'd simply swapped the two. Vaughan Williams in the morning, Last of the Pharaohs in the afternoon. The interesting thing, however, two things. Firstly, Vaughan Williams got a record audience for in spite of it being 9 o'clock in the morning on New Year's Day. I mean, huge audience by Channel 5 standards. I mean, several million. Land of the Pharaohs the audience was so low it couldn't be measured. Second point, scheduler got fired. So you say, how have I suffered? I've suffered because of morons like that, middle management morons, who should be all taken out and shot, the lot of them.
Well, with that cri de coeur and hearty recommendation, I'd like to thank you very much for spending this time with us today, Tony.
That's okay. People should read this book. I mean, I would want to say, aim to your face, this is a rather important book. Yeah. I don't agree with some of its bias. I think it's unfairly loaded, pro-Trump, anti-Biden, to take extreme case. And I got sick and tired of endless references to Biden's laptop. But nobody actually tells me what's in the laptop, other than clearly been involved in nefarious activities. And it would have been nice to have had something about the English newspapers, or also, I mean, equally, in a different way, corrupt. I mean, the whole saga of phone hacking, which decimated many people's lives and took place in England in Rupert Murdoch's newspapers. And I mean, it's Piers Morgan.
Yes.
Or as he's called in private eye, Piers Morgan. And I mean, I know you want me to shut up. I'm just going to give you one example of the wonderfulness of English newspapers at the moment. This is from The Times. Now, The Times is thought to be a really important place of opinion, place of find out who's died in the obituary column and so on. Here's an entire page given over to somebody called Corran. And number one, we have a picture of poolside at Jack's. Then there's a big picture saying campfire in the desert. And then there's another one saying quad biking in the Kalahari. And finally there's a picture saying meeting a muscat. I mean, that's the level to which English newspapers have sunk.
Yeah. Après uns, the deluge.
Yes.